know that in 1485, King Henry VII successfully snatched the throne of England from under King Richard III's feet, but what do we know of Henry's ancestry? How did the Tudor name come to be in the first place? Well, to discuss all of this, I'm pleased to welcome historian Nathen Amin onto the podcast for the first time to discuss his book, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. From Henry's 6 times great-grandfather who presented his prince with 3 severed heads as a present, to Henry Tudor's grandfather, Owen Tudor, nibbling the cheek of a Queen Dowager, Catherine of Valois. All of this and much more will be covered, so settle in and get one hell of a lesson in Welsh and Tudor history. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 89, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor, with Nathen Amin. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast. Nathen Amin, how are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me on to discuss what I hope is going to be an exciting and enlightening, illuminating episode.
I'm sure it will be, and I'm excited for this one because what I love about your book, Son of Prophecy, is just how many new characters there were for me to, Welsh history is not my forte, like many people. And so to discover these new Tudor ancestors was really exciting, and just how far back you go, which we'll come to in a bit more detail. Before we get into the conversation, though, a few questions to get to know you a bit better. So can you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what you do full time?
Yeah, I am a writer and historian originally from West Wales, where I was born and brought up. Very much Tudor family country, West Wales. Home of the Tudors, home of Dylan Thomas, home of me. An exciting and beautiful part of the world to be brought up in. I now live in East London, which couldn't be more different from where I was brought up. And I've spent the last, I guess it's probably 12, 13 years researching the early Tudors and the reign of Henry VII. And for my living, I do work as a writer for companies. So far more of a, how can I say it, let's be honest, a much more boring way to make a living than writing about the escapades of the various medieval people we love to study.
Was there a moment growing up that really sort of sparked your passion for Tudor history and in particular the story of Henry VII? Or was it, I suppose, being a Welsh native and growing up where you did, is that kind of what sparked it?
I didn't get into the Tudors until I was in my 20s.
Okay.
It's not something I can claim to have been one of those people who from childhood was captivated by the stories of medieval knights and the Tudors. I do know my good friend Nicola Tallis, she had a Queen Elizabeth cake for one of her birthdays. And I know that Susanna Lipscomb talks about as a child, she was brought up around Nonsuch Palace. They had this pull towards this subject from childhood. I can't claim that for myself. As a child, I focused more on sport, to be honest. I certainly was a well-read teenager. I had ambitions to become a journalist. I was always fascinated by, the wide arc of history rather than specific subjects, geography, just in general. But I can't say that there was one Tudor spark until I got to my mid-20s and I started learning that there was this Welsh guy from my backyard who went on to found the Tudor dynasty. And there didn't seem to be that many people interested in him around 2009. So I started a blog writing about him and sharing my research, and it's just grown from there.
That's actually something Susie and I share in have in common, Susanna Lipscomb, that is, because like her, I grew up around Nonsuch and it's where I go every day to take my dog for a walk. So if you could jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment from history, what would it be?
I'm going to give you two. The obvious
Okay.
answer to keep it on brand would be 1483. I don't know the exact moment, but I do believe at some point during the summer of 1483, two boys were murdered in the Tower of London. Now, of course, I
Yes.
can't say that for definite. That is what happened. If that did happen, I do not know who did it. But if from my interpretation of history, if that is correct, there is a moment in 1483 that Richard III, or someone acting on his orders, is going into the Tower of London and eliminating two threats. And I'd like, depending if people listening are of a certain age and brought up in Britain, they will know this from a show we had in the 90s called Harry Enfield and Chums. I would like to go up and go, "Oi, Richard, no." And hopefully prevent a murder from taking place. Off
Yeah.
brand, in reality, my favorite part of history I would like to go back to would be Kinshasa in Africa to May of 1974 and watch Muhammad Ali do the unthinkable, which is knock out the man monster George Foreman in one of the greatest moments in sporting and probably modern human history. I would like to have had a ringside seat in the thunderstorm to have seen that.
Wow, that's a first, definitely, as far as people's answers to that sort of question. So, again, on topic for today, if you could ask King Henry VII one single question, what would it be?
Bore da, Harry, wyt ti'n siarad Cymraeg? Which is, "Good morning, Henry. Do you speak Welsh?"
Okay.
And it would be interesting to see what response I get.
Yeah, because well, it is on topic, but there's some suggestion that he spoke with a slight French accent. Do you truck with that? Is there anything in you've discovered that suggests that was the case?
It mention is made of Henry that he wanted to reign in the French manner. And that is certainly true when we look at things he brought on board, such as he wanted to centralize much of the mechanics of government. He wanted to surround himself with a bodyguard. He definitely was influenced very heavily by what he had seen during his time in France in exile. Now, does that mean that he spoke with a French accent? I'm not sure. But it is the case that the Frenchness of him was certainly remarked upon. He had spent
Right.
14 years across the Channel. Now, technically, 12 of those years were in Brittany, which was then an independent duchy. But Brittany certainly was heavily under the influence of France. They spoke Breton and French there. I think Henry, it's a very good argument. He spoke French better than he spoke English. I also
Hmm.
think it makes sense that considering he was born and brought up in Wales and lived in Wales until the age of 14, that he would have known some degree of Welsh.
Yeah.
Today in Wales, any child in school has to study the Welsh language up to the age of 16. That is the law in Wales. And of course, you can have first language Welsh or you can have second language Welsh. I suggest that if Henry VII was in modern day Wales, he would at the very least have had a second language Welsh GCSE qualification. I think
Right.
it just makes sense that he would have known some Welsh. But we do
Hmm.
not have any solid evidence for that because, of course, during his reign in England, nobody cared enough to document that Henry was able to speak Welsh. But he certainly surrounded himself with plenty of Welshmen during a period that the Welsh were not necessarily speakers of the English language.
Okay, so but by default, then that would suggest that yeah, he was able to converse in Welsh if he's not surrounded by people who are particularly au fait with the English language.
Yeah, it's unprovable, but again, we're looking at common sense, human history here. Yeah.
So we're here today to talk about your book, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. Before we get into the conversation around the book itself, I wondered if you could explain the old Welsh naming conventions for me, because it's something I'm not massively au fait with, but I understand as much that I believe sons would often take their father's surname as their given name. The two-letter ap would be included somewhere. So what was the process around this?
So yeah, so we have what's called patronymics, and patronymics was in existence in England. It seems to start losing some of its popularity perhaps around the 11th or 12th century. The English soon come to adopt surnames. You know, some people take on their father's name, and that continues to be their name. Some take on a surname based on where they're from or what job they have. You know, Smith,
Mhm.
for example. Today, patronymics is still in existence in Scandinavia, for example, and I also believe in parts of Eastern Europe. The Welsh, we we're in the middle of that. We retained it for much longer than the English did, but we certainly haven't retained it to this modern day. It started to lose currency in the 15th and 16th century. But essentially, the word ap means son of. It's the Welsh
Okay.
equivalent of what the Normans used to use Fitz and what the Irish, I'm told, used to use Mac. So to give one example, let's take Henry Tudor as an obvious example. Henry Tudor, his name in Welsh would be Harry ap Edmund, and that is Henry, the son of Edmund. In fact,
Uh-huh.
in the standard convention of the day, you would normally use three names. So it would be Harry ap Edmund ap Owain.
The
Henry, the
son of
son
son
of
of.
Edmund, the son of Owen. Now, generally speaking, during this period, most of the Welsh took great pride in their lineage and in their pedigrees because, quite frankly, they didn't have much means, they didn't have much wealth. To the medieval Welshman, their lineage was everything. And it was said that the average Welshman could trace their lineage back up to eight degrees. So Henry Tudor, for example, his lineage, which would have been worn with pride, would have been, let me see if I can get this right. Harry ap Edmund ap Owain ap Meredydd ap Tudur ap Gronwy ap Tudur ap Gronwy. So just like that, an average Welshman, a Welsh person, Welsh lady, they could name their previous eight ancestors. And it's
Yeah.
hugely important as well in a small community to avoid too much intermarriage. It is simply just the standard of how the Welsh operated at this time. Now, one thing to take note here is the Tudor name. This
Mm.
is an anglicisation of the name given to Owen Tudor. The truth is, when Owen Tudor migrates to England as a young man in the early 15th century, his name is Owain ap Meredydd ap Tudur. Owen, the son of Meredith, the son of Tudor. The English clerks don't seem to understand this concept of patronymics, and when they
Hmm.
decide to assign him an English-style name, they simply contract those three names into two. So Owen, the son of Meredith, the son of Tudor, becomes Owen Tudor. They get rid of the middle name. So that's where the Tudor family name comes from. In truth, if we were to assign Owen Tudor, Owen, an English style surname, it should have been his father's name, which is Meredydd, and therefore we should not have the Tudor dynasty, we should have the Meredith dynasty. He should be
Hmm.
Owen Meredith, not Owen Tudor. But it is fascinating, and of course, not something people understand have, if they don't have any knowledge of Wales, and even within modern Wales, some people do not understand. We once used patronymics.
I see. Okay. And was it also that English clerk who restructured, well, spelt Tudor differently because back originally it was Tudur. Was the O, was that down to the clerk as well?
So the Tudur is how the name should be spelt in Welsh, and it's pronounced Tudur.
Okay.
Now, throughout Owen Tudor's life in England, that name is spelt many ways. There wasn't a standardized version of it, but each variant given, you can see it's based on the pronunciation of Tudor. And this would have been how the name was pronounced during the reign of Henry VII, because we do see Richard III write about Henry Tudor. Now, some people today think that's Richard III making fun of Henry VII. It's not. It's Richard III simply saying the family name the correct way. The
Yeah.
spelling of Tudor that we all know and love, as some people hate if you're Ricardian, that doesn't really come into currency until perhaps as late as the Elizabethan period and the 1700s. That's when it becomes standardized as Tudor. Before that point, it's just various variants of the Welsh Tudor.
I see. Okay, I didn't realize it went that late with the spelling not standardized. So until reading your book, have to admit I hadn't realized just how much time you cover. You cover a vast time period, and you open with the story of, please forgive me if I butcher this, Enifed Fitcham. How should it be pronounced correctly?
Ednafed Vychan.
Ednefed. Okay, so you open with Ednefed, who is Henry Tudor's six times great-grandfather, I believe, a man born at the end of the 12th century. And sort of straight out the door, he makes a pretty barbaric mark involving three heads. So what was the story here?
So during this period, Ednafed he's living in what is called the Kingdom of Gwynedd. By the 13th century, the last remaining Welsh kingdom is Gwynedd, which, for those who are aware of modern day Wales, is basically the area around Snowdonia in the northwest and places like Carnarvon, Bangor, Conwy. It's that very top corner of Wales. That is an independent kingdom. It is not part of the Kingdom of England at this time, but it is undercoming increasing pressure as the English kings seek to subdue it, invade it, and conquer it. But during Ednufed's lifetime, he is serving as what we could call in modern parlance the Prime Minister of the Welsh Prince Llywelyn the Great. But to answer your question about this one remarkable episode that he's involved in, which I opened my book with, I think it's a striking moment that begins to place this family on the map. We don't know precisely when, because the sources aren't particularly descriptive, but we're told that during one particular skirmish with King John's men, the big bad king of historical renown, King John, during one skirmish with his men near Chester, Ednafed Vychan went into the conflict, and when he returned back to his prince's court, he had in his hands three English heads. And he presented them to his prince as a sign of his military valor and as a gift. Quite a gruesome gift. But Prince Llywelyn, he seems to have been happy with that, because from that day forward, he allowed Ednufed to change his coat of arms and display three heads on his coat of arms. So it obviously was a remarkable moment. And it was something that earned Ednufed a great nickname. And that nickname was the Terror of England.
That's a powerful nickname right there. That's going to put the fear of God up certain people, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. What a name to brandish. And Ednufed goes on to become quite a vastly important person in Anglo-Welsh politics during this time, because he is the man leading a lot of the discussions with the English kings during this period. There's a lot of treaties taking place. In fact, we believe Ednufed was on the banks of the Thames in 1215 when Magna Carta was being sealed between King John and his barons, because Ednufed was sent to England to represent the Welsh side, because there are some clauses in Magna Carta that deal with Welsh interests, and he's the man negotiating some of those. So, he would have been quite a significant and respected figure on both sides of this English-Welsh divide.
Yeah, as you said, he ends up serving Llewellyn the Great. And why is it at this point that the relations between Wales and England are at such a low? What was driving that, just that animosity between the two nations, effectively?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is that the Normans should who have invaded in 1066 and we gradually come to acknowledge as the English, they're expansionist. You know, they are an expansionist force. They have
Mm,
they have erupted out of Normandy. They have conquered and taken England in a matter of weeks, and they are now looking to push their boundaries of their empire across the centuries. And it's just natural that they would come into conflict with the Welsh people.
hmm.
Within a matter of generations after the Norman conquest of England, large sections of the Welsh people have been conquered. But there still remains sections of Wales in the northwest which the Normans are not able to fully conquer. And that's because the Welsh become masters of their own territories. Every time English armies invade, the Welsh retreat into the mountains. They do not give battle. Why would they face down a superior military force on equal grounds? They engage in guerrilla warfare. And Gwynedd does not fall to the English until 1282. So
Okay.
throughout this period, there is just a natural conflict between enemies. This is not unique to England and Wales, of course. France themselves were a great expansionist empire throughout the medieval
Mhm.
period. And of course, it's natural that the Welsh themselves would also look to defend their interests and not take this lying down. So it's just a case of big brother, little brother in a
Mhm.
far more violent way than we still see today.
So Ednifed eventually becomes the Seneschal of Wales. So what was this position and what was involved?
I mean, I would describe it as essentially the prime minister. I think originally this position, so it would be seneschal to use, you know, the Norman phrase for it. In Welsh, it was known as Distine. And originally, this is the person who's effectively in charge of his lord's household and his lord's horses and things like that, you know, a household official. But by Nufford's day, it's essentially you are your lord's prime minister, his chief minister. You are the man involved in diplomacy. You are the man involved in arranging the royal court. The highest official that isn't a member of the royal family.
So forgive me if this offends, but it sounds slightly similar, I guess, to maybe where Cromwell gets to at some point in his career at the time of Henry VIII. Is that a similar? Is there a comparison there?
I mean, I would suggest probably yes. You know,
Yeah.
in quite a basic form. I'm sure that there would have been very specific roles assigned to the office of seneschal, which aren't directly comparable to what Cromwell later becomes. I think he becomes
Mm,
things like, you know, vice regent and all this, all these interesting offices that he eventually gets within his grasp just before his fall, of
yes.
course. But you know, it is a role that is vital and one of considerable prestige. I would
Mm,
say that could only be given to a well-rounded individual who, you know, has the administrative, judicial, and military foresight to help govern the the kingdom.
yeah.
So
He was
one of the most trusted confidants, we could say, kind of like Cromwell, somebody you are trusted to do the job for you.
Yeah, he was clearly to get to this. I mean, if we consider that, you know, he sort of makes his mark by bringing Prince Three Heads, but from that to then effectively prime minister, this was clearly a very capable man.
Yeah, you know, a remarkable figure, I think. And when he does eventually die, his death is, you know, he is very much mourned by the great bards of the day. One of the bards who makes a poem claims that he was stood at Ednufford's graveside and he was weeping for him because this great man had left the people behind. Fortunately, Ednufford did bequeath a remarkable legacy in the form of his descendants, who all strove to follow his example. There is a famous concept that even 100 years later in Wales, it was known as the Sons of Ednufford, because he left this remarkable legacy that seeped down throughout the gentry of the Welsh people during that period, who all traced their lineage back to this particular man. And for that, they were able themselves to build a remarkable legacy of influence themselves.
I see. Okay, so the relations between Wales and England take another sort of nosedive in the reign of Edward I. So by this point, we're going to have Ednufford's descendants playing roles. So what roles did his descendants play in fighting against the English king?
So in 1282, Gwynedd is conquered. Prince Llewellyn is killed. His brother Dafydd briefly takes control and is then himself killed. And as far as the Welsh as an independent people are concerned, that's it. It's over. Wales and the Welsh are now a conquered people. And Edward I goes straight to work establishing all these incredible castles throughout North Wales that we still see today, to create an iron ring to oppress, suppress the Welsh, to cower them into submission. And it works. The English crown has too much military and financial might for the Welsh to resist. Welshmen have a choice at this point. They can either accept the reality of the situation, or they can attempt to resist and be crushed. But they have to make do with the best of a bad bunch. And that's what we see. We see the 14th century as a full of Welshmen being kept out of the main offices and roles to be played in Wales. All of the major positions, titles, and offices are given to English families who are planted into North Wales to take. The Welsh become, in effect, a second-class citizen in their own country.
I see, okay. So I'd like to jump ahead a bit now towards into the 14th century, by which point Henry Tudor's great-grandfather, now again, forgive me, is it Merdad, the pronunciation?
Meredith. So think of Meredith.
Okay.
But Meredith.
Meredith. Okay, Meredith ap Tudor and his four brothers, they're on the scene. So these are Henry Tudor's great-great-uncles and great-grandfather. So what can you tell me about this group of brothers? Did they go into royal service for the English king?
For this one generation of brothers that you've mentioned, they, by the end of 1390s, at least two of them, Rhys and Gwilym ap Tudor, because their father was called Tudor, so they are Rhys and Gwilym, the son of Tudor. They are actually in the employ of Richard II. Now, Richard II is an incredibly unpopular tyrant in England, and he has started to attempt to shift his power base and his headquarters away from London to Cheshire, which is the one part of England where he has some form of respect and authority and devotion. And part of that, of course, reaches across into North Wales, where he enjoys some of that with Welshmen like Rhys and Gwilym ap Tudor, who are part of his servants. Another man at this moment who enjoys an all-right relationship with King Richard is their first cousin, a man called Owain Glyndwr. Now, Owain Glyndwr has an impeccable ancestry. He is descended from at least 3 Welsh royal houses. He is the most blue-blooded Welshman of this period. And people look up to him and they treat him with respect. And the issue for Owain Glyndwr is that, again, despite this respect and position among the Welsh, the avenues for him to grow are, but there's a barrier in place. And then Richard II is overthrown. And in his place comes Henry IV of the House of Lancaster. And Henry IV of the House of Lancaster is, of course, no friend to friends of Richard II. So just like that, men like Owain Glyndwr and the Tudor brothers are even more out in the cold than they were. And Owain Glyndwr enters a neighbourly dispute with one of his neighbours, Baron Grey, who happens to be a friend of Henry IV. And Henry IV takes the side of Baron Grey. So what does Owain Glyndwr do at the age of 50? He finally decides, after 100 years of the Welsh being a subdued people, he is going to lead his people into rebellion. He is going to raise the flag of independence. He is going to assume the title Prince of Wales, and he is going to return independence to the Welsh people. Enough is enough. 100 years we've had this issue. We are now going to fight for our freedom. And of course, his most ardent supporters are his first cousins, these brothers, these sons of Tudor, who all flock to his side. And we get the next decade between 1400 and 1410, where the Welsh are in open revolt against the English crown, with something that we still call today the last Welsh War of Independence. And there is a moment during these 10 years where it looks like Wales is going to win its freedom. Owain Glyndwr is remarkable, tireless in his campaign. Wales is set ablaze in this war, and it is a war that is ultimately taking place between two princes of Wales. There is Owain Glyndwr, who claims to be the Prince of Wales, and on the other side is a teenage boy who is the son of the King of England, Prince Henry, who is the future Henry V. This is where he learns the art of warfare, fighting with the Welsh and fighting with the Tudors throughout this decade. And just think about that for one moment. On one side, we have the Tudor family. On the other side, we have the House of Lancaster. In 80 years after this moment, remarkably, it would be a Tudor who would become head of the House of Lancaster. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, also, I wanted to also briefly touch on, and we'll come back to this window around Henry IV in particular, but I also wanted to just briefly ask you about, you make a reference in the book that during the reign of Edward III, that the Welsh people had started to, where in England there'd been this progression towards a sort of unified national identity, that this was also happening around this time for the Welsh people. So in what ways was that happening?
Yeah, I think it's very much a response to England and Edward III really fostering this great English identity. And it is the reign of Edward III where he really begins pushing Englishness. You know, we get things like St. George, we get the Order of the Garter, and this is obviously a response in itself to the war with France. No longer are we going to have this complex identity crisis in England where we are English kings, or kings of England of French descent. We are now going to be English kings of England. This is very much Edward III's propaganda move, and it works. There is a massive upsurge in English identity during this century. And of course, that has a knock-on effect of the Welsh becoming a unified people with a unified sense of belonging. Again, the Welsh always knew they were different to the English. The Welsh word for another Welshman is Cymru. And that means comrade. You know, it is or Cymro,
Hmm.
you are my comrade. The Welsh knew they were the same people, but they didn't necessarily understand it in the terms of a statehood of Wales. When Owain Glyndwr finally leads his rebellion at the end of the century, his vision is remarkable. It's not to return the kingdom of Gwynedd, the kingdom of Deheubarth, the kingdom of Gwent, the kingdom of Powys. He doesn't want to return to the old days. He wants to create a Welsh state.
I see. Okay. Jumping back into the reign of Richard II, you mentioned a few moments ago that he is viewed as something of a tyrant. He's generally considered to be one of the worst kings in English history. So, to that end, what was it that was driving the Tudor men's commitment to Richard's cause?
It just goes back to that concept that Richard looked upon Cheshire and his North Welsh tenants reasonably favourably. So he might have been a monster in the rest of England, but he did favour and provide some opportunity to North Welshmen. So we get during this period, some of these brothers of Tudor started to be given the odd office here and there. Nothing significant, the office of bailiff, perhaps, or sheriff, or forester. Very basic roles, much beneath what Ednaf Edfychan had once been able to carve out for himself. But it's something. And if somebody's offering you something that's more than what you've had already, then of course you're going to accept it, because what is the alternative? The problem for the Tudor brothers and for their cousin Owain Glyndwr is when Richard II is removed, these small offices are also removed and they're back to square one. Now, the great question, of course, which is hotly debated in Wales, would be, would Owain Glyndwr and his cousins have rebelled and created this Welsh independence movement that still has incredible legacy today if Richard II had remained on the throne? I'm not so sure. Men might have sincere beliefs in their actions, but self-interest is also a very important driving force.
You mentioned it's something that was complete news to me is that Henry Bolingbroke, so the man that becomes Henry IV, he ousts Richard II from the throne, that Henry IV was the first, well, the English king that had the most land in Wales from the moment he is king. So how did he come to have such extensive Welsh lands?
Through a quirk of history, ultimately. I mean, when the Welsh people, very complex scenario, let me give it a go. After the Norman conquest of England, the Normans expanded into parts of Wales, and they were able to capture, if you think of what Wales looks like today, they were able to capture much of the lands that are down the English border and along South Wales. So again, if you know what Wales looks like today, Swansea, Cardiff, Newport, and all up the English border, Hereford, Ludlow, Chichester, all of that was captured by Norman lords. Many of them created their wealth along that territory. I'm thinking of great families like the Stafford family, the Lancaster family, the York family, the Mortimers. They all had their power bases for 400 years along this part of Wales. Now, the furthest west and north you go into Wales, as I said earlier, they retained their independence until 1282. But in 1282, those areas were conquered by Edward I. So you end up with Aberystwyth, Carnarvon, Honwy, Anglesey. They came under the direct rule of the King of England. So by the time we get to 1400, we have, let's say, a third of Wales is ruled by a whole series of English baronites, and another two-thirds of Wales is directly ruled by the King of England. Now, one of those baron knights is the House of Lancaster. They own a significant amount of land around Monmouth, Grosmont, Skenfrith. You know, Henry V himself is known as Henry of Monmouth because that's where he was born. He was born in the Lancastrian lands in southeast Wales. So when Henry Bolingbroke becomes king, He retains his Lancastrian inheritance, which is vast. It's one of the greatest inheritances all in England. We know this. The House of Lancaster, they had something like 4 or 5 earldoms at this time, and then they become the King of England. In Wales, Henry the Fourth already owns much of southeast Wales, but now as King of England, he takes control of all of those lands that are under the King of England's control. So you're able to merge the Lancastrian inheritance with the royal domain.
So you mentioned obviously that the reign of Henry IV, there is this big Welsh rebellion, and the Tudor brothers are prominent in that. It goes wrong. Does the rebellion destroy the Tudors as a prominent and influential family at that stage?
Yeah, it completely wipes them out as the North Welsh family of influence because they've gambled with their cousin and they've lost. The rebellion, it looks like it's going to prosper. It looks like it's going to win. But that young teenage Prince of Wales, Henry V, the future Henry V, he finally starts to get going. And once he gets going, an English financial might is too much for the Welsh to ward off. It's just a matter of time before the English are successful. Now, Owain Glyndwr, as the leader, one day he escapes off up into the mountains and we never hear of him again. He is never betrayed. He is never captured. He simply disappears, which is part of his remarkable myth that still remains in Wales today. But for his cousins, one of the men, Rise ap Tudor, he is captured and executed. His brother Gwilym ap Tudor, he is captured, but he accepts a pardon, but he dies shortly thereafter. 2 other brothers, Ednyfed ap Tudor and Goronwy ap Tudor, they have both died before the rebellion. Apparently they drowned drunk in Kent, so they're gone. And then we get the final brother, Meredydd ap Tudor. We don't massively know what happened to him, but he does seem to have died before the end of the rebellion. So the family tree is almost completely extinguished. They are rebels. They've been condemned as rebels. They are destroyed. And what the King of England thereafter does is he punishes all of the Welsh collectively, whether they were involved in the revolt or not. So Wales is a mess, a bigger mess than it was before this rebellion. The Welsh are now completely punished across the board. And this means that for the young Welshmen who have survived, there's nothing left for them in Wales. So many decide to join the English army, which is now looking to leave England and go and fight in France. This is why Henry V's famous French armies are full of Welshmen, because he knows what the Welsh can do. He wants to take the flower of Wales out of Wales so that they don't rebel again, and take them to France to fight. And for these young Welshmen, well, there's nothing left at home. Wales has been razed to the ground. Not to make too much modern political comparisons, but if you look around the world, even as we speak, there are parts of the world that are lying in ruins because this is what warfare is. It leaves behind scorched earth. Now, one young Welshman, the son of Meredydd, he decides to leave home as well. But he doesn't go to France. I think that's because he's too young. He goes to England. And this is our old friend, Owain ap Meredydd ap Tudor, who in England becomes Owen Tudor. There is nothing left for him at home. He goes to England. We would call that today an economic migrant, in modern parlance. He goes to try and find prosperity anew. And this finally shifts the family story out of Wales and brings it to England.
And it's Owen Tudor that's, I suppose, the first name that most people are going to be relatively well aware of, even if they don't know a huge amount about him, because he is the grandfather of Henry VII. So how does he find a role at court?
It's quite difficult to pinpoint exactly what Owen Tudor is up to and where he was doing this. There is suggestions that he entered the service of a lord called Walter Hungerford, who is well known to the widow of Henry V, Catherine of Valois. I would suggest there
Hmm.
is somehow a link has happened here where Owen Tudor has perhaps transferred from Walter Hungerford's service into the service of Catherine of Valois, who he then enters an illicit affair with and eventually marries and has children with. We
Hmm.
don't know for certain much more beyond that, other than at some point, somehow, Owen Tudor has met this young widowed queen, the mother of the boy
Yeah.
king. He has met her, and this Welshman and this Frenchwoman, both young in age, in their 20s, both living away from home. I would make a suggestion, both isolated, perhaps. Something brings them together. Uh, we know that. And they begin this remarkable relationship between a Welsh squire who is the son, grandson, and nephew of rebels with the mother of the King of England.
Yeah.
You could not
Yeah.
make that
A
up.
French princess as well.
That, yeah, if that was in a fiction book, it stretches the bounds of credulity.
Well, so I believe that part of the legend of how they met is that his head fell into her lap. Is that the right story? But I think it is a legend.
It's difficult to know how they met again because this is a relationship taking place in secrecy. There isn't much written about it, but what we know is that, spoiler alert, but Owen Tudor eventually gets executed many years later. Um, and when he's executed, it is recorded that he remarks upon the execution block that it's astonishing that the head that once lay in Queen Catherine's lap would now be lying on this chopping block. And that has inspired future legends written during the Tudor period in the 16th century that one day at a dance, he got drunk and fell into her lap, and she fell in love with him. And there's another legend that he was swimming one day, and Queen Catherine saw him and took a fancy to him. Um, the only real contemporary record we have is written by a Welsh poet called Robin the Black, who knew Owen Tudor personally. And he simply wrote that one day Owen Tudor fell in love with the daughter of the king of the land of wine, which is obviously France. We don't know for certain the
The
actual
courtship, yeah.
truth.
There is this brilliant story though about him nibbling her cheek. So what was that? What's that story all about? I know that, again, there's question marks over it, but it's a funny story nonetheless.
Yeah, so this is another Tudor legend. Apparently, Owen Tudor, being an amorous young Welshman, had taken a fancy to one of Queen Catherine's maids. The maid was complaining that he wouldn't leave her alone. So Queen Catherine says, okay, one day, give me your servant clothes and I'll wait for him in the room. And Owen Tudor sneaks into the room in the dark. And every time he tries to kiss this, quote unquote maid, she keeps on turning her face away from him. And he gets annoyed
Hmm.
and he thinks somebody's playing a joke on him and he doesn't like being taken for a fool. So he bites her cheek so that he knows that next day at dinner service, he can see which woman is playing a joke on him. And of course, when he goes to serve the Queen her dinner, he looks up and Queen Catherine has a mark on her face. Owen Tudor panics. He runs to the stables. He tries to escape into Wales, but Queen Catherine sends her men after him, has him arrested, and then somehow they fall in love.
They do eventually marry though. We know that beyond all doubt. Was this, given the disparity in their rank, was this viewed as quite shocking?
It was viewed as problematic, I would say. They do marry in secret, and they do have these children, and the births take place under the guidance of the Bishop of London, who is part of the King's Council. So I think that news is out there in the very highest circles of what's happening. And if it's not condoned, there's an element of, well, what's happened has happened. But when Catherine dies in childbirth, Owen Tudor is suddenly arrested and thrown in prison. And he arguably would have languished there if it had not been for the mercy of his teenage stepson, Henry VI, who, when he finds out about this, he actually goes against his council's orders and pardons Owen Tudor and takes two of his half-brothers under his own royal guidance. He gives them a proper royal upbringing, and Owen Tudor himself enters the service of his stepson.
As you mentioned, they have sons. The two of their sons, Edmund and Jasper, reach adulthood, and they are half brothers of the king, Henry VI. And Edmund, the firstborn, is how the Beaufort name actually comes into the mix, because he marries Margaret Beaufort. Now, I appreciate it's difficult to explain it succinctly, but who were the Beauforts?
The Beauforts were an originally illegitimate family born to the great John of Gaunt and his mistress Catherine Swynford. And they are the half-siblings of Henry IV, and then their respective descendants. So Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI on one side, and then you got the Beaufort family going through the generations on the other side, are very close. But in 1452, Henry VI, after many years of marriage, does not have a son. There's a major feud taking place between the leader of the Beaufort faction, Edmund Beaufort, and the leader of the York faction, Richard, Duke of York. Both men have potential claims to be the next king. They are both of royal descent, and they despise each other. Henry VI, I believe, he looks to try and solve this conundrum of who should be the next king by taking his half-brother, Edmund Tudor, and marrying him to his cousin, Margaret Beaufort. Now, Edmund Tudor is half Welsh, half French. He has no claim to the English throne. Margaret Beaufort does have a claim to the English throne. So I think Henry VI, in his mind, because this wasn't the most sane of kings, and there's no way this plan would have been accepted if indeed it was the plan. I think he's trying to create an alternative royal succession. He wants his cousin to marry his brother and create a new line of double Lancastrian succession. But almost as soon as that happens, Henry VI finally has a son. So this whole plan, if indeed that was a plan, is just pushed to the side. Nobody would know that after 30 years of warfare, that bloodline would one day come back to take the king, whilst everybody else was killing each other. But it's fascinating that this is what Henry VI does. He creates this bloodline that has half Welsh and half French, but Welsh royal blood and French royal blood on one side, and now on the other side, English royal blood. And the child that will be born from this union is, of course, Henry Tudor. When we erupt into the Wars of the Roses, obviously Edmund and Jasper are staunchly in support of the king and not the Yorks. I mean, is that a fair assessment? We don't really know much about Edmund, because Edmund, during the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses in 1455, is sent into South Wales to deal with some rebels. But Jasper Tuda, a young man, aged about 22 years old, 1455, we get the Battle of St Albans, where Edmund Beaufort is murdered. And then we've got this brief Yorkish ascendancy in 1455, 1456, 1457, where Jasper is actually working with the Duke of York to try and maintain the peace. He's very much seen as part of Richard of York's friendship circle. But then, as the decade reaches its end, and it clearly becomes an issue that there's going to be no peace between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, choices have to be made. And it's at that point that Jasper drops any hope of peace. He leaves Richard of York's side, and he becomes the number one staunch defender of Lancaster, his half-brother's crown, throughout the rest of the reign. And he becomes very much the iconic figure of the House of Lancaster resilience during the next 20 years. But initially, there's ample evidence he was hoping that peace would reign. It's only when Richard of York turns around and says, you know what, I want to be king, then it's all bets off. Because we have to remember, the Wars of the Roses was not dynastic to begin with. It was simply about who gets to govern England, not who gets to be king. It's only when Richard of York can't see any way ahead and he's outmaneuvered by the Lancastrian faction that he goes, do you know what? King it is.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing about the Wars of the Roses that a lot of people maybe misunderstand as well is that but just the title Wars of the Roses, it makes it sound like there was this constant back and forth, but actually there were there were sometimes many years where the country was at peace, and actually it was more a series of sort of skirmishes and battles quite far apart. So the actual understanding of what it was, I think, is sometimes slightly lost on people.
And I think obviously the term Wars of the Roses is a Victorian creation. Just the concept of a dynastic war was very much known during the 15th century. By the Tudor period, it is viewed as, the war of the houses of Lancaster and York, but it doesn't have that catchy title. It is just understood for what it is, rival houses fighting, but it doesn't have that catchy title, Wars of the Roses. But I don't see a problem with Wars of the Roses anymore. Again, it's a term that's been around for centuries. We understand it, but people miss wars. It's plural. It's not singular, which supports what you're saying. The Wars of the Roses are, we have 1455 to 1457. We've got a factional dispute. Then we've got the first Wars of the Roses, for lack of a better term, 1459 to 1461. It's over in 1461. We get pockets of resistance throughout the 1460s, but there's no meaningful wars taking place till we get to this sudden outbreak of activity in 1470 and 1471. I would suggest the Wars of the Roses, in so much as it is a dynastic war between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, is over in 1471. Edward IV wins the dynastic wars. It's over. What happens in 1483 and 1485 is a civil war within the House of York. Henry VII is not really a Lancastrian contender. He is put there, he is propelled to power by Yorkists. His supporters are York. They are the people who push him to the throne because of what they believe, rightly or wrongly, Richard III did in that period.
So with the Wars of the Roses, Edmund Tudor, so Henry VII's father, is captured by the Yorkists and dies while in prison. So how did that come about?
So the traditional story is that Edmund Tudor is sent into Wales by Richard of York to capture the royal castles, because at this point Richard of York is in charge of the government. While Edmund Tudor is in Wales, there's this squabble taking place in London, and Richard of York is removed from power, but now he wants the castles in Wales back, because now there is this feud taking place between York and Lancaster. So Richard of York, from being Edmund Tudor's friend in Wales, is now Edmund Tudor's enemy in Wales. And Richard of York sends a group of his Yorkist loyalists into Wales to capture Edmund Tudor and capture the castles back. Edmund Tudor goes into prison, and then Edmund Tudor dies. Historically, his death is given as plague, for which there is absolutely no historical justification to say so. It is just another one of those facts that has come down to us. When you actually look at the context of the war that was taking place in Wales, when you look at the people who were besieging and imprisoning Edmund Tudor, which were his dynastic rivals, the Herbert family, and when you see the fact that the Herberts were arrested and tried for their actions in Wales, at a trial at which Jasper Tuda and King Henry VI himself showed great interest in, I would suggest Edmund Tudor was bumped off during this great outburst of violence in 1455 and 1456. And of course, why wouldn't the House of York bump him off? This is a guy, the House of York have just killed Edmund Beaufort at St Albans. Edmund Tudor, who is being raised up with this royal bride he has, Margaret Beaufort, to be a future leader, potential inheritor of the House of Lancaster. Why wouldn't the Herberts, whether of their own volition or acting under the Duke of York's orders, get rid of him when they can? Everything about this period, everything about the trial suggests very strongly Edmund Tudor was murdered, and it also coincides with the moment that Jasper Tuda finally leaves Richard of York's side.
So he dies just weeks before his son is born. So we've got to him, Henry VII. Well, the boy that grows to be Henry VII. He's named for the King Henry VI. Now, famously, Margaret Beaufort was just 13 when she gives birth, which means that she was very likely impregnated at the age of 12. Was this viewed even back then as a shockingly young age for Edmund to have consummated the marriage?
Absolutely. There's a lot of confusion today about childbirth, etc. back then. And I've heard people say that Margaret Beaufort being 12 was just normal for the period because girls were allowed to marry at 12. And in fact, during a talk I gave last year, a woman decided to interrupt and suggest that we should have no sympathy for Margaret Beaufort because 12 was normal. Now, there is a school out there of opinion who do not like Margaret Beaufort. She's one of the most maligned females we have, historic females we have today, for reasons beyond my comprehension. People just despise
her. I mean,
her.
a big part of it's Philippa Gregory.
Well, yes. I mean, Philippa Gregory has completely destroyed Margaret Beaufort's reputation by making her a villain in many of her books. And then, of course, we have a very potent movement of Ricardians who despise her, as they see her as being the architect of Richard III's downfall. Both schools of thought are completely unfair and completely ahistorical in their treatment of Margaret Beaufort. But this lady during my talk wanted us to not garner any sympathy for Margaret Beaufort for being 12 years old because she doesn't deserve the sympathy because this was quote-unquote normal. Now, categorically, 12 years old is not normal for childbirth during the 15th century. For one reason and one reason not. Biology. A 12-year-old in 1457 is the same as a 12-year-old in 2025. Girls that young are not, they're not structured for childbirth. Things haven't changed biologically in 500 years. We know from the sources that Margaret Beaufort's life was despaired of, and we know that she never had children again. The working assumption is she never had children again because of injuries she suffered during the childbirth. I'll say that's a fair assumption, but we should be careful to say we can't prove that. She could equally have suffered mental trauma and decided not to, put herself in a position again where she didn't have children. It could simply be that she wasn't able to have children for other reasons down the line.
So we've effectively only sort of covered half your book really by this point, but in the interest of not taking up all of your day, my final question really is around the presence of Henry Tudor during the reign of Edward IV, because by the point where Edward IV is established on the throne, he's got his brood of children, the Lancastrian faction are now grossly depleted. Henry Tudor leaves for France with his uncle Jasper, and there is evidence that Edward IV was concerned about Henry's presence, but why didn't he take steps to have Henry returned to England? Do you think that whilst he was cognizant of the threat that Henry Tudor posed. He didn't necessarily think that it was a significant threat, as it were.
I would actually suggest the opposite. I think Edward IV did go to quite a lot of steps to try and get Henry Tudor back in England. What I would let us be clear first and foremost. There is nothing to suggest that Henry Tudor was a prospective King of England until Richard III takes the throne of England. We get this other enduring belief, again through the work of Philip and Gregory, that Margaret Beaufort had lifelong ambitions for her son to wear a crown. Though there was no codified line of succession for the period, another thing people don't understand, there was no line of succession that says, you are number 7, you are number 8, you are number 9. There were many people within England during the 1470s and 1480s who would have been far more readily accepted as the next King of England than Henry Tudor. No one is putting this boy forward as a King of England until Richard III becomes king. People believe the princes are dead. There's no one else left because of various deaths through conflict and natural causes. And he is the only figure left outside of Richard's grasp who can be put forward to lead a revolt. Let's just be clear there. But that's not to say that the House of York did not view Henry Tudor's existence outside their grasp during the 1470s as an irksome loose end, because this boy was descended through Margaret Beaufort of the Beaufort claim. He very clearly is a nephew of Henry VI on his father's side. In fact, he is regarded by one chronicler as being the only imp left of Henry VI's blood after 1471. It is clear he is a threat to Yorkish security, if not as a boy, certainly in future. So Edward IV tries in 1471, within a couple of months of Henry Tudor fleeing the country as a 14-year-old boy, to get him back. The Duke of Brittany refuses. The Duke of Brittany, who has Henry Tudor, he is coming under pressure from two sides, the French and the English, to hand over the boy to them. So he keeps hold of him, and he keeps hold of him for the next 12 years. Now, throughout that period, Edward IV regularly reaches across the Channel and tries, through shipping across chests of gold and to promise the Duke of Brittany men to fight the French, he'll give all of these if he hands over Henry Tudor. And after Henry Tudor is in exile for 4 years, the Duke of Brittany is worn down, and he does actually hand over Henry Tudor to the English envoys in 1476. And Henry Tudor, aged 19 years old, is taken to a boat that is ready to take him back to England. He later said he believed if he stepped foot on that boat, he would be carried to his death. And I do believe that, because in England, Edward IV had, for lack of a better term, had embarked on a Lancastrian purge. He had wiped out anyone who had Lancastrian royal blood in their veins. Henry VI, his son Prince Henry, two of the Beaufort brothers, and Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter, were all killed or executed. Henry Tudor is now about to come aboard, come back to England, and I believe he would have been snuffed out as well. At the last moment, Henry Tudor fakes an illness, he escapes his captors, and he lives to fight another day. Edward IV, in 1482, he has grown quite fat with success. He's very secure on his throne. He has two sons, the heir and the spare. He has nothing left to fear. For those people who've watched Game of Thrones, he is Robert Baratheon. He has won. So now he listens to Margaret Beaufort, who for the previous 10 years has been in his ear. Please let my boy come home. Please let my boy come home. Edward IV listens and he goes, you know what? I will let your boy come home. If your boy comes home and bends the knee to me and accepts me as king, I will allow him to come home and become the Beaufort heir to all your estates, Margaret. And he signs a draft pardon, and it sits in his draft folder, waiting to be confirmed when he does something very stupid and he goes and dies. And this sits there in the draft folder, unsigned, and Margaret Beaufort goes to Richard III and they have a private meeting. Officially, the private meeting is about a Beaufort family debt that Margaret Beaufort is owed. But I believe that she asked Richard at this time, will you honour your brother's promise and let my boy come home? He's now 26 years old. He's unmarried. He stands to inherit all my lands. He can be one of your great earls. I believe Richard said no. And Margaret Beaufort comes out to that meeting and she goes straight to work, conniving and conspiring against Richard. Not to make Henry a king, but to let Henry come home and perhaps make, first of all, restore the princes in the Tower to their position. After the moment it is believed they've died, to make her cousin, the Duke of Buckingham, the King of England. And when he is executed, to then finally go, okay, my son becomes king, he marries Elizabeth of York, and we create a new dynasty. So, to answer your question in a very long, rambling way, Edward IV was more than concerned about the presence of Henry Tudor outside England because he was a loose end that quite simply just needed to be snuffed out. Nobody really was concerned Henry Tudor would become King of England. It was just, let's finish clearing up this Lancastrian mess.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Nathan, for coming on and having a chat today. I've kept you for a very long time, but this has been utterly fascinating, and there's been a lot that I've learned. I'm sure that people are going to have exactly the same experience when listening to this. So for people who want to keep up to date with you and all you do, where can they find you?
I am on all the usual social media sites under my name, Nathen Amin, where I am increasingly exclusively using Substack. So Google Nathen Amin Substack. It's called A Chronicle of Dragons and Cats, where I am writing regular historical articles on Henry VII, on the medieval period, and also just the art and craft of writing. So please come and join me there. I do many live Q&As, articles, spotlights on historical occasions, and I'm enjoying it. So please come and be part of my club.
And that's just reminded me of something, actually. And you mentioning Robert Baratheon, the Game of Thrones reference. Do you buy into the theory that Daenerys Targaryen is maybe loosely based on Henry Tudor?
Oh, absolutely. And it was a major reason why I was, from day one, a Daenerys fanboy. I loved her. I loved her entire arc. I don't care what people say about the last season. I cheered her all the way to the bitter blazing end.
Well, I liked the ending. I didn't have an issue with it.
I didn't have an issue with it. I can't claim to have ever been a hardcore Game of Thrones super fan. I enjoyed it for what it was. And yeah, I mean, all through the series, I was pointing out the clear inspirations that George R. Martin took from Game of Thrones, from The Wars of the Roses. He's on record as saying as much, and Daenerys is absolutely clearly that royal exile with the dragons abroad. And of course, as we all know, Henry Tudor, Henry VII, had a dragon as his emblem. And not only that, as a final point, the prince that was promised, as it's known in Game of Thrones, is a complete rip-off of the historical Son of Prophecy, which is, of course, the title of my book.
Yes. Would you want to briefly explain that? Because that was something that I would have liked to have briefly covered, actually, is there was this prophecy.
Yeah, throughout the medieval period in Wales, there was a prophecy that foretold a national messiah would one day return to free and liberate the Welsh people, or the ancient Britons, from their Saxon conqueror. And of course, as the medieval period pushed on, the Briton became the Welsh, the Saxon became the English, and every time a Welshman of note rose to the fore, So I'm thinking of Prince Llewellyn. I'm thinking of Owain Glyndwr. They were given the title the Son of Prophecy, the person who would liberate the Welsh and would one day be crowned king in London. That never happened until one day Henry Tudor started to make waves. The Welsh bards went into overdrive. They gave him the title Son of Prophecy. And of course, he was victorious and he was crowned king in London, a Welshman born of Welsh royal lineage. And he was given the title Son of Prophecy. And after hundreds of years, the Welsh bards finally put down their pens.
Well, there you go, folks. That is the story of the Son of Prophecy. Thanks again, Nathen. This has been a brilliant conversation. Are you working on anything new at the moment, or are you just focusing on your full-time job, as it were?
Yeah, I'm just messing around with Substack for the time being. I'm currently retired from writing books, shall we say. I'll focus my energies at the moment on just producing more public history.
Okay. Well, thank you again for coming on the Tudor Chess podcast, and we will speak soon, no doubt.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. My thanks to Nathen for coming onto the show, and thank you to you for listening. If you have any podcast requests, be it for podcast guests or podcast subjects, please do get in touch with me on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and see you next week.